Hello and welcome. My name is Henry Sullivan and I manage Edinburgh City Archives, which holds over 900 years worth of recorded history of the city. Today I'm going to talk about the city's boundary extension back in 1920, 100 years ago this year. Hopefully I will give you an overview of how and why it happened, why it was and still is contentious, and what place it has in the city's history and development. This talk forms part of a programme, ReDrawing Edinburgh, which will consist of other talks and activities commemorating the event and celebrating the communities that came into the city at the time. Some of these talks and activities will be organised by the City of Edinburgh Council's Archives, Libraries and Museum Services, but others will be done by our community partners in each area. More information on this programme can be found on our webpage, www.edinburgh.gov.uk/1920 Boundary Extension. For event news and updates, please also follow the Facebook pages of Edinburgh City Archives, Edinburgh City Libraries and the Museum of Edinburgh. The 1920 boundary extension was arguably the most significant single expansion of the city then and now. It incorporated the borough of Leith in the north, the Midlothian suburban district parishes of Cramond, Corstorphine, Colinton and Liberton to the west and south of the city. At a stroke, the city trebled in size to 53 square miles and expanded its population by nearly a third to 425,000 people. It was a culmination of over 150 years' worth of expansion for the city, but it was resisted by a wide range of parties, most notably the Burgh of Leith, who fought until the end to retain its municipal independence. On the 30th of July 1919, Edinburgh Town Council formally passed a resolution to seek the extension of the city's boundaries to include not only Leith and the Midlothian suburban parishes I already mentioned, but also the borough of Musselburgh and the parishes of Inverness and Newton, all of whom were in Midlothian County. This proposal would not only extend the boundaries, but also merge the various public authorities in the area. Edinburgh Corporation would provide services such as policing, transport, street cleaning and planning, while a single education authority and a single parish council would run the schools and health and welfare services respectively. The language of the day referred to this process as amalgamation. The proposal would also seek to gain the authority to harmonise and expand the transport network across the area, hence the Tramways part of the Act title. Over the course of the rest of 1919, the Edinburgh Town Clerk drafted a parliamentary bill to gain the necessary approval in London. A setback was the plebiscite held in Musselburgh in October 1919, which came surprisingly out against the proposal, with an over 2-to-1 majority, despite the support of the local provost, treasurer and borough officials. Edinburgh Town Council nonetheless continued with its bill preparations, and a final draft was approved in January 1920 and submitted to Parliament under the private legislation process. 38 separate petitions against the bill were lodged. Leith Town Council then held its own plebiscite in January to demonstrate the depth of feeling against the bill and to back up its arguments with a democratic mandate. The result came unsurprisingly and overwhelmingly against the proposal. Over April and May, a House of Lords Select Committee heard evidence from a number of official representatives, exploring a range of topics including finances, housing, public health, transport and urban development. During this time, Midlothian County Council and its Education Authority dropped their opposition, and Edinburgh accepted in return that there was not enough parliamentary support for the amalgamation with Musselburgh, Inverness and Newton. By June 1920, the only opposition came from the Leith Town Council and its Education Authority, as the amended bill went to the House of Commons for consideration. While the House of Lords consideration had been primarily technical in nature, the House of Commons had a very vocal member for Leith who strongly fought against the proposal. Captain William Wedgben, the Liberal MP for Leith, opposed the bill with supporters at every turn and gave eloquent speeches in his defence of his adopted constituency borough. Yet it was not enough, for too much momentum had been gained behind the bill, and Ben was fighting against his own party. The only concession he managed to get out of his objections was the retention of Leith as the official port name, which is still retained to this day. On the 28th of July 1920, the bill passed through Parliament, and royal assent came soon after, creating the Edinburgh Boundaries Extension and Tramways Act of 1920. Elections were held in October, and on the 5th of November, the new council met for the first time, enlarged with 71 councillors. 12 came from Leith, and 9 came from the suburban parishes, with Cramond and Corstorphine being merged into one ward. 2 councillors from Leith were then immediately elected as bailies of the city, which was an office of authority in the pre-1975 borough. Greater Edinburgh, as some now called it, had been born. This is an overview of the area in 1920, of broadly industrial Leith, rural Midlothian and commercial Edinburgh. The borough of Leith was by far the biggest of the 5 areas that were to come into the city in terms of population, but the other 4 together were bigger in geographic size than Edinburgh and Leith combined. and they also had more of a spread of distinct communities. While this slide is a neat summary, this talk cannot give a full picture for each area. For that, I am leaving to the talks held by our community partners in the project. I will, however, quickly point out that while Leith was indeed industrial, Colinton and Liberton both had industrial concerns of their own at the time, and Edinburgh's own industrial workforce was larger than Leith's in sheer numbers, if not proportion. Furthermore, this is but a picture of the areas in 1920, ignoring centuries of population change and industrial development, such as the pioneering 18th century ironworks in Cramond and the 19th century shale oil industry in Strait. What I will try to do next is cover in brief detail the different areas of life in these areas at the time. Firstly, housing. In 1920, it was a major concern for both Edinburgh and Leith Town Councils, as well as most of the urban areas of the UK. The vast majority of the urban working class in the area lived in one- or two-room apartments with tenements built in the 19th century, often with wholly inadequate facilities for their occupancy levels. During the First World War, housing quality and rent levels had become significant political issues, especially in Scotland, where the situation was made worse with higher rents and less available housing. These frustrations boiled over into rent and industrial strikes, Glasgow's being the most famous, which the Liberal government at the time responded to with the Homes for Heroes pledge in the 1918 UK general election. This resulted in legislation that empowered local authorities to build social housing themselves, rather than rely on private developers, and, crucially, to use the UK government as a source of funds to finance development. However, the standards recommended for the new housing encouraged less dense development than the traditional tenements favoured by Scottish builders. This meant that while the new housing policy regime provided access to funds and a directive to build, local authorities still needed land, preferably cheap land, to build on. Leith in particular was constrained by its high population density and lack of undeveloped land within its boundaries, having less than 200 acres left in 1920 for both industrial and residential development. While Edinburgh had more land to build on, it was starting to lose population to the surrounding parishes after years of explosive growth in the 19th century. It was also concerned that its undeveloped land was not always cheap or available for working-class housing development due to speculators and developers waiting to create the latest affluent neighbourhood to generate high rental income. While land availability was not an issue for the Midlothian parishes, the quality of the housing varied significantly, from mansions with all the modern utilities to 18th century cottages with none. As Malcolm Count, a noted local historian at Edinburgh, captures in his Villages of Edinburgh on Davidson Main in 1900, housing and street sanitation were primitive. Main Street was flanked by rows of single-storey cottages without electricity or gas or running water. Dry closets were the order of the day or night. Water was carried from one of the metal standpipes or from the village well at the west end of Main Street. Street furniture and road maintenance were rudimentary. The first street lighting consisted of a series of wooden posts about 8 feet high at very long intervals, on which were fixed metal brackets to hold oil-burning lights. Tied with housing and people's day-to-day lives were the utilities that gave them water, heating, sanitation, and electricity. In 1920, water and gas were provided to most residents of the area, including the Midlothian parishes, by two organisations, the Edinburgh District Water Trust and the Edinburgh and Leith Corporation's Gas Commission. Set up in the 19th century as joint ventures between Edinburgh, Leith and Portobello, with Midlothian County being involved in the water provision, and they were not private companies, but statutory trusts, each with representatives from the partner councils sitting on the board. Each had a dedicated department that provided the service with powers to raise money through specific direct taxation on residents. A third organisation, the Water of Leith Purification and Sewerage Commission, was set up to manage the sanitation system built around that river, but did not have the same taxation powers as the other two, instead splitting costs between the partners. Statutory trusts required Acts of Parliament to establish and were used throughout the UK in the 19th century as a way for local councils to cooperate on services that made sense to provide at a larger level than a single borough or county. However, they were inflexible in terms of their governance and operations, as any major changes that were needed to keep up with the times required further Acts of Parliament to undertake. Due to these inflexibilities, each of these organisations was suffering from growing, if different, issues in 1920. The Gas Commission was required to annually pay legacy shareholders, which limited investment in infrastructure. The Sewerage Commission was limited to only the Water of Leith, and so Edinburgh had to build its own separate system for the rest of the city. The Water Trust had different charging regimes for urban and rural areas, which over time resulted in unequal rates being levied. It's not to say that there weren't any successes by these organisations. From 1870 to 1905, the Water Trust built 4 reservoirs along the rivers Esk and Tweed to provide clean water to the Edinburgh area. Likewise, the extensive Granton Gas Works was built under the Gas Commission in 1903 to provide gas to the whole Edinburgh area again. However, by the 1890s, Edinburgh Town Council had become frustrated with the existing statutory trusts and refused Leith Town Council's suggestion for further ones for electricity and tramways. This meant that the electricity supply, Edinburgh and Leith went ahead and created their own separate power stations. Leith Station could only supply the borough area, with the docks having their own small generator. But Edinburgh's covered the Midlothian suburban parishes as well. During the First World War, both town councils struggled to provide enough electricity supply for their wartime industries, but under an arrangement required by the government, they agreed to share capacity, with Edinburgh providing the bulk for residential use across the whole area, and Leith supply being used to cover the docks and shipbuilding. After the war had ended, Edinburgh Town Council got government approval for their plans for a regional power station at Portobello, which undercut the plans for Leith Town Council for their own second power station. One of the big drivers of population shift within the area was the increasing transport links between the city centre and outlying communities. Rail links had already been created prior to 1920 to a number of outlying communities, with stations on the suburban line in Corstorphine, Craiglockhart, Juniper Green, Kingsnow, and Slateford, but these mainly served affluent middle-class commuters rather than the working class, who still preferred to live close to where they worked. Prior to 1920, buses were also run between communities in Midlothian and Edinburgh by the Scottish Motor Traction Company, which had little to no competition during the war years. For the majority of Edinburgh and Leith residents, however, it was the trams that they took to get round, and it was a source of common frustration that in 1920 there were 2 separate systems. This manifested as a physical divide of Pilrig Street, which required travellers to get off one tram and get on another if they wanted to move between Edinburgh and Leith. This was the infamous Pilrig Muddle. For 20 years between 1873 and 1893, there was a unified horse-drawn tram system, with no break or muddle between Edinburgh, Leith and Portobello. However, in 1893, when the initial lease came to an end, Edinburgh and Leith Town Councils made different decisions on who should run their part of the network, eventually leading to Edinburgh committing to a 21 private lease based on a cable car conversion in 1898, and Leith staying with the original company and horse-drawn system until they took it over themselves directly in 1904 and electrified it a year later. By doing so, Leith had leapfrogged Edinburgh by going straight from a horse-drawn system to an electrical one under direct public ownership, but together the 2 councils had ended up creating the split along the border. There was no doubt in 1920 that the electric tramcar system was the future of the city. Indeed, in 1919, Edinburgh Town Council had finally created the Edinburgh Corporation Tramways Department and brought its network under its direct control, the expressed intention of electrifying it. The dispute between the 2 town councils then came to how the system should be unified once again, Edinburgh seeking amalgamation to bring both systems under one authority, whilst Leith desiring another joint statutory trust to run it for them both. I have focused on housing, utilities and transport as they were the main focus of the Act itself, but other aspects of municipal life should be mentioned, at least in passing. In terms of police and fire services, both Edinburgh and Leith had each, with the Leith forces covering the docks as well. The growth of housing along and over the border did cause some issues due to different bylaws needing to be enforced, but these were generally managed sensibly by the 2 forces. Due to concerns about bombing, an agreement was made between Leith and Edinburgh to share firefighting resources during World War I, though this was never actually taken up. While Midlothian had a county constabulary, it did not have a corresponding fire service. Instead, private insurance companies and volunteers filled the gap in the Midlothian parishes. In 1920, welfare was provided under the reformed poor law system via civil parish councils, which were separate from the town and county councils. Many of these parish councils joined together to set up and run poorhouses, but both Edinburgh and Leith had their own. Craiglockhart and Craigleith for Edinburgh and Seafield for Leith, which was actually the last poorhouse built in Scotland in 1908. The Midlothian parishes sent their destitute and sick to either Edinburgh or Dalkeith in the case of Liberton. In terms of health, most general hospitals in 1920 had grown out of the poorhouses and were the responsibility of the parish councils to run. Public health services such as infectious diseases hospitals, particularly concerned during the 1918 influenza pandemic, were run by town councils, while other specialist services such as maternity operated as charities. Unsurprisingly, given the complexity of today's NHS, public health and special health services were rapidly growing in demand in the early 20th century and were often on the outskirts of cities needing significant amounts of land to be built on. In the Edinburgh area, this had resulted in various health institutions being built in Midlothian suburban parishes, while Leith had to rent lands off Edinburgh Town Council to build its poorhouse and hospital Seafield. In 1918, the focus on education reform in Scotland was shifting from primary provision to secondary provision, which was made free under the 1918 Education Scotland Act. Larger education authorities were also created as the means to build and manage a new wave of secondary schools. In 1920, both Edinburgh and Leith had separate education authorities, while Midlothian County had its own education authority for its whole area, including the suburban parishes. Secondary school provision was limited, with Leith comparatively well served with its 3 academies, which already took both primary and secondary school ages. In terms of leisure provision across the area, it was quite patchy. Bowling greens were everywhere and very popular, but only Edinburgh and Corstorphine had public libraries. In fact, Corstorphine had a wealth of amenities, including a public hall, curling rinks, and a tennis club in addition to the library. Public golf courses were in particular demand, and both Edinburgh and Leith struggled to meet the demand, with Leith Town Council actually renting land in Cramond to build its golf course in 1908. As you can see from this map, prior to 1920, Edinburgh had already been expanding for over 150 years, driven by changes in housing, utilities and transport, which had knock-on effects on policing, education, leisure and health and welfare. During the 153-year span, Edinburgh Town Council switched between either playing catch-up or speculator, by seeking minor extensions to its boundaries to cover new communities like Roseburn and Dalry. Extensions over Blackford Hill and Braid Hills were primarily civic in nature, seeking to provide parkland and public golf courses for the city. The 1896 extension marked the first attempt by Edinburgh Town Council to amalgamate with other boroughs, namely Leith and Portobello, but much like Musselburgh in the 1920 bill, Leith was left out of the eventual act, with only Portobello joining the city at that point. Subsequent expansions in 1900 and 1901 filled in the gaps between the city's existing areas, with the addition of Granton partly due to the major city gasworks that were being built there. The 1920 proposal, however, represented a step change in ambition, with a vision by the Town Council of a greater Edinburgh to meet the issues and challenges I've already talked about, which leads us nicely onto the arguments made for and against that vision. 38 separate petitioners lodged against the initial bill submitted to Parliament in January 1920. They can broadly be split into 3 groups: public authorities, companies and other organisations, and private individuals. Most of these dropped their objections over time as the bill was amended or the petitioners received binding agreements by the Leith Town Clerk that their rights and interests would be protected for periods of time, some of these even extending over 10 years. Where this did not apply to was in Leith. Even before the 1920 amalgamation bid, the relationship between Edinburgh and Leith had often been a contentious one. This quote from the last Lord Provost of Leith, John A. Lindsay, neatly sums up the pride that many Leithers had and still have in their history as a separate community and port stretching back to the 12th century. Unlike Aberdeen, Dundee and Glasgow, Edinburgh was not founded on a major river, but on a defensible hill. Leith was the community on the major river, and if history had panned out differently, I could be referring to Greater Leith rather than Edinburgh in this talk. However, Edinburgh was made a royal borough as early as 1124, so its independence was never in question. Instead, it was Leith, despite its location, who struggled to obtain its independence. Unfortunately, as what often happened to settlements which did not have secure borough status in the Middle Ages, Leith ended up being split between separate lordships: the Abbey of Holyrood, the Logan family of Wresselrig, and the harbour, which was held by the Burgh of Edinburgh. For over 300 years, the citizens of Leith and the burgesses of Edinburgh fought with bribes and influence over who should hold those lordships, but by 1724, Edinburgh had succeeded in acquiring all of them. However, governing these proved to be difficult for Edinburgh, for it had to manage the different lordships separately rather than as a single unified area. This proved to be utterly unsuitable by the early 19th century, as Leith population growth made a mockery of the feudal distinctions. Things came to a head in 1827, when Edinburgh was required under an Act of Parliament to appoint magistrates to govern Leith as a discrete entity. These arrangements did not last very long, for in 1833 Leith was given the coveted status of a municipal borough, with its own town council, finally on equal footing to Edinburgh. It was this status that Leith Town Council fought so hard to keep 87 years later. Follow-up legislation during the 19th century reaffirmed Leith's independence. By 1920, Leith had plenty of external validation for its independence, including being its own parish council, having its own parliamentary constituency, and its own education authority. No other borough in Scotland, aside from the Big Four, had all of these. Plus, it had already defeated the amalgamation attempt by Edinburgh Town Council in 1896. These arguments in 1920 were that it should not lose all of this for some potential administrative benefit, which it disputed anyway. In a similar fashion, those in Midlothian parishes who rejected amalgamation argued that that the Edinburgh Town Council was seeking to do was unprecedented. Unlike previous expansions into Midlothian, which focused on strips of land where residential suburbs of Edinburgh had simply expanded beyond the city's boundaries, this was wholesale absorption of parishes. It would bring under municipal authority ancient independent villages and estates that had been governed by county authorities for centuries. While historical rights and precedents were used in arguments against the amalgamation proposal, the more common issue raised was about how such a large organisation could successfully reflect the concerns of all its constituents' parts if it went ahead. The argument went that the different communities had different priorities, and that a single authority would force upon all areas a single set of priorities. I can give you a couple of examples of specific arguments made in Parliament and press at the time. Some in Leith argued that Edinburgh's public library system was not a priority for Leith and its industrially-focused citizens. Labour Party candidates had run in previous borough elections on a platform of instituting such a system and were defeated. Leith would get a public library when it decided it wanted one enough to pay for it. Some Lothian estate owners complained that the improvements around sanitation, lighting, water and gas that would be required under Edinburgh would cause unnecessary expense and disturbance to their estates, effectively applying urban standards to a rural reality. Other objections centred around concerns from mining companies and trade associations that their businesses, which had been set up under a rural county council that understood the importance of mining and agriculture, would be harmed by stricter regulations of an urban authority. In a similar fashion, two transport companies objected to Edinburgh Town Council's plans to establish tram and bus routes of its own in what was previously a lucrative market where the county council saw no need to come up with a transport solution of itself. Mixed in with these objections was the belief that Edinburgh Town Council was a prolific spender, willing to spend on amenities that other areas could not afford. Even Edinburgh Town Council accepted that they had the second largest municipal debt in the UK after London at the time, amounting nearly to £5.7 million. To the opposition, amalgamation was a way of Edinburgh spreading its debt across a wider tax base, which would suffer higher taxes to pay for things they either did not need or would not receive the benefit from. Edinburgh Town Council's defence was that its citizens benefited from such spending on hospitals, street improvements and utilities, and that crucially so did the surrounding areas as well. It shouldered the greater burden of capital investment and joint ventures as the largest authority in the area. Much of the subsequent argument came down to individual tax rates and debt ratios, which I won't go into today, which you may be pleased to hear about. Another argument made against the amalgamation proposal was that it wasn't actually wanted by the residents in the areas to be amalgamated. During the course of the bill, there were two plebiscites undertaken to show Parliament what public opinion was. In the case of Musselburgh, it was organised by the pro-amalgamationists and spectacularly backfired when the result came in over 2-1 against the proposal. It certainly foreshadowed the dropping of the borough and the parish of Inveresk and Newton from the bill and was backed by changes in the local town council during elections held there shortly after the plebiscite. The Leith plebiscite, on the other hand, was never in doubt, and there was some public eye-rolling in the media about it being held at all. Unlike the Leith plebiscite, where there was a pamphlet released with detailed information on the proposal and a number of weeks' discussion and campaigning, the Leith one was just one question: are you in favour of amalgamation with Edinburgh? With voters being given 1 week to respond. The voting card sent out was a postcard size. As much as people called it the lightning plebiscite at the time, it was also dismissed by some as the postcard plebiscite. The difficult point for the amalgamationists was that they were pitching administrative efficiency against local democracy, and they knew, especially after Musselburgh's poll, they would struggle to win that argument. So they discounted it by arguing that democracy would be no less in the enlarged council than it was in the current situation. It was not a position that could be won in the streets, but it did find traction in the Houses of Parliament, and that ultimately is where the decision would be made. In the case you think that Midlothian parishes were sleepy and quiet, content to be amalgamated into the city, I give you this quote below from a petition to Parliament from some, but not definitely all, of the ratepayers of Corstorphine. Now we move on to the arguments for amalgamation, primarily made by Edinburgh Town Council, but there were supporters across all the areas, even in Leith, where the local Labour Party and Trade Council approved of amalgamation as the means to strengthen local government. The core argument of the amalgamationists was that the areas covered by the proposal were either already or in the middle of becoming a cohesive whole, and that this whole had too many public authorities running things. This isn't a very exciting slide, but it does show you the number of pre-1920 public authorities that run something in the Edinburgh area. 17 in total, and a resident would likely come into contact with at least 6 of them if they lived and worked in the same borough or county parish. Many, but not all of these, would tax you for their particular service, usually based on property valuation. In terms of efficiency of governance, the amalgamation proposal would reduce this to just three: the Education Authority, the Parish Council, and the Town Council. In the proponents' eyes, this simplification would create savings by minimising legal and management costs, and strengthen services which could draw upon the resources of the entirety of Greater Edinburgh. Edinburgh Corporation officials drew up detailed reports on both the savings and investments they could make off the back of amalgamation, and these provided the backbone to Edinburgh Town Council's case of how a unified authority would be better. What also helped were real cases of cooperation that happened during the First World War, where the two town councils worked together on electricity supply, fire services, and health and welfare provision due to wartime necessities. I've already briefly covered the role of the three statutory trusts that delivered utilities to the area, but one thing to add was that Edinburgh Town Council saw amalgamation as the answer to these trusts. In Edinburgh's eyes, they were legally separate middlemen in an already complicated public sphere, which required lengthy and expensive negotiations for any major change or expenditure to be agreed between the partners. Given that these trusts received an estimated 60% of the combined budgets of Edinburgh and Leith at the time, they were significant organisations that provided key services, but which struggled with long-term planning and accountability to the citizens they served. The amalgamation proposal would simply remove the need for these trusts, which would instead be managed as departments within the unified authority, directly accountable through the enlarged town council. Another key part to this argument was that other municipal authorities had already undertaken similar extensions to their own boundaries for the same reasons as Edinburgh. Edinburgh Town Council cited Birmingham in 1911, Glasgow in 1912, Dundee in 1913, and Plymouth in 1914 as examples where Parliament had agreed to extensions on similar grounds as the one proposed in 1920. Leith argued, with some justification, that the overall balance and scope of these previous extensions did not match what Edinburgh was proposing. The difference was on scale rather than principle. The argument that this was part of a trend and in line with government policy, which domestically had been broadly the same since 1905, was persuasive on Parliament, and it was also a key difference between the 1920 bid and the 1896 one, where there was far less examples of amalgamations to point to. In the evidence submission to Parliament, Edinburgh Town Council commissioned a series of aerial and street photography of the boundary between Edinburgh and Leith, drawing a white line where the boundary lay, sometimes to deliberately farcical conclusions. Not only were the streets split in twain, but actual tenement flats and public houses as well. The Boundary Bar, now the Beer House on Leith Walk, is still famous for its legend of having different serving times in different ends of the bar. The point being made was that there was no practical boundary between the two boroughs, and that it would only get more muddled as additional development was undertaken. Leith Town Council argued, again with some justification, that the Edinburgh Town Council had surrounded it as a deliberate policy by acquiring, in a piecemeal fashion, the lands adjacent to it over the 24 years since the last failed amalgamation attempt in 1896. Yet that argument did not change the map, simply explaining how it happened, and there was no serious proposal to transfer the likes of Granton, Warriston, or Craigentinny to Leith instead. Both Edinburgh and Leith struggled to find land for some of their amenities and services. The 1920 proposal dealt with Edinburgh's issues, but Leith had no answer for its lack of space other than the status quo. In an age of expanding local authorities in both size and scope, this was not a strong defence. While the Midlothian parishes were not surrounded by Edinburgh, their designation as a suburban district implied recognition of their ties to the city. While mansions and estates of Edinburgh's elite had existed for centuries in these areas, the proponents of amalgamation argued that the expansion of the suburban railway and the spread of utilities during the 19th and early 20th centuries brought more middle-class residents, who worked in the city and used its services more often and in volume. It was only fair, went the argument, that they contributed towards the city's maintenance and development. Edinburgh Town Council could have simply asked Parliament for just the Midlothian land that existing development had spread onto, like it had done a number of times in the past. Yet it knew that that development would soon spread again, and so sought whole parishes instead to allow it to proactively plan and manage that development. This fitted well within the growing town planning movement within the wider UK at the time. With the arguments laid before it, Parliament considered the matter and approved the amalgamation proposal, turning the amended bill into the Edinburgh Boundary Extension and Tramways Act of 1920. What had been discussed daily in local halls and newspapers throughout the Edinburgh area during the first half of 1920 became an occasional reference by the end of the year, except in Leith. The way the town council fought for its independence to the very end, and how the lightning plebiscite was ignored, became an integral part of Leith's history and coloured the view of subsequent events. To give you an idea of the level of upset within Leith, The last page of the official minute book of the borough makes no reference to the impending amalgamation, simply recording the legal costs of opposing it, which were now to be paid by the successor authority in Edinburgh. That being said, there was also a view in Leith at the time that the fight had been fought and lost, and that it was time to make the arrangement with Edinburgh work, as you can see from the speech from Councillor William James Harvey. That both views are still present in Leith today is a testament to the strength of the identity Leithers have and their connection to their old borough. So that is the tale of the 1920 boundary extension, well, at least a summary of it. Its importance in simple terms was that through the extension, the city grew in size, both in population and in area, becoming the largest municipal authority by area in Scotland. It also set the boundary in place for 50 years, and for the east and southern boundaries, they have yet to change 100 years on. Post-1920, Edinburgh Town Council used new legislation to plan out development in the city. Unfortunately, the Great Depression hit those plans very hard. With the onset of the Second World War, another hiatus had to be endured. Nonetheless, the boundary extension and what interwar social housing and development that was undertaken managed to stop the population loss that the city had experienced in the early 20th century. Between 1921 and 1946, it's estimated 116,000 people moved from the city centre to new housing developments, broadly around the outskirts. This was then further extended into wider housing development in the 1960s and 70s. Crucially, Edinburgh never significantly lost any of its citizens to the new town schemes from the late 40s through to the 70s. Glasgow, in comparison, lost 200,000 residents in the 20 years between 1960 and 1980. For those areas that came into the city, they saw extensions of the transport network linking them more easily to the city centre, expanding utilities and generally better quality housing. Parks and sports facilities were improved and maintained, and secondary schools and public libraries came later. In Leith, a new town hall was built in 1932, with a public library and a theatre as a gift to the citizens of Leith from the people of Edinburgh. However, there were also inevitably changes to the character of the areas. Small but noticeable changes like changing street names, where there was duplication elsewhere in the city, came first. As housing and development followed, it meant that old Midlothian parishes became less and less rural, though it was gradual in most places before the Second World War. Likewise, Leith saw an overall population decline during the interwar years, which accelerated afterwards, as much of the migration to the outskirts to the new developments came from the area. Even its industrial focus was eventually challenged and changed in the years after the Second World War. Now, I've deliberately stopped this talk from stretching out much beyond the Second World War, because by 1946 it would be hard to assign any particular developments in the city to simply the Extension Act. I've stuck to the Act itself because, while there is plenty of scope to explore individual communities both before and after 1920, that should be properly left for those communities to tell it. With this talk, I hope I have at least explained how it came about that those communities became part of Edinburgh, making it greater in the process. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this talk. Remember, for more information on the ReDrawing Edinburgh Boundary programme, you can go to our webpage www.edinburgh.gov.uk/1920 boundary extension. So now we're going to have some questions and hopefully answers from people who've submitted questions prior to the presentation. Let's look into a little bit more about the 1920 Act and the extension. So the first question, what changes happened after the extension? So to answer this question, I've got up here a lovely map from the 1946 Civic Survey, which shows in a sort of yellow-orange colour the extension or the expansion of the city between the interwar years, between 1918 and 1939. You can see from where it is that is broadly in the areas that came into the city in 1920 and following existing development as it already happened. In terms of sort of day-to-day development that citizens would have noticed after the 1920 extension happened, one of the most sort of physical and noticeable at the time would have been in relation to the transport network. The Tramways department set up bus routes for the new areas that came into the city, but the major focus was on the tramways coming into the different areas as promised within the Act. The Tramways department started their planning in 1921, and then the work started in earnest in 1922. And they had sort of both the three aims really to harmonise the network between Leith and Edinburgh, to electrify Edinburgh's network, and to then extend Edinburgh's network out to the sort of residential suburbs and communities that came in 1920. The Big Buck event, when an electric tram was run between Leith and Nether Liberton, the Lord Provost on it, was on the 20th of June 1922. But work continued electrifying the rest of Edinburgh's sort of cable car network for at least another year. After that, from 1923-1924, the work then focused on extending the tram network to the sort of old Midlothian parishes. And by the end of 1924, all of them except for Cramond had been connected via the electric trams. Subsequent extensions in the later 20s and 30s went further within the old parishes to connect communities on the border and with new residential developments as well, like Stenhouse. In terms of utilities, Portobello Power Station was in fact built in 1923 and did indeed provide power across the region as promised, and then was also extended in 1938. In terms of housing, the 1946 Civic Survey of the city records that 43,471 dwellings, that is both apartments and houses, were built between 1918 and 1939, with new social housing developments in Craigmillar, Granton, Nidri Mains, Piers Hill, Sawton, and Stenhouse, and Warriston as well. Ironically, given the arguments during the amalgamation proposal that land was needed for less dense housing development, 88% of the council housing built during the interwar years was actually still tenements, and it wasn't until after the war, the Second World War, that the city began to significantly build low-density housing schemes, such as in the Inch in 1949. So second question, how were changes communicated to local communities? Okay, so the primary means of communication would have been newspapers at the time. Certainly the newspapers covered the amalgamation proposal, the ins and outs of it in terms of the progress through the House of through Parliament, as well as the sort of arguments made by the sort of pro and anti sides of the debate. And certainly also both sides outlined what would happen in the event that the amalgamation happened. Certainly Edinburgh put out what sort of rates would be there and what development would be there in terms of tram extensions and improvement of services. So the newspapers certainly covered it prior to 1920, and the changes in relation to post-1920 would have been covered by the newspapers as well, though not as sort of in detail with as headlines. Certainly, local councils published changes to do with council services with the newspapers, as they still do now. So that's the sort of main way. I suppose another thing to point out is that the amalgamated areas came into the city in 1920 with elected members, councillors. The Leith had 12 councillors across their 4 wards, and the suburban parishes, the 3 wards, had 3 each, so 9 councillors as well. And there's definitely evidence to show that certainly communities were keeping an eye on the developments. We've got evidence to show that Corstorphine was not particularly happy that it hadn't had a tram connection as promised under the Act direct through to the city centre by 1923, and so that was sort of upgraded to be a through route to the city centre. So there you go. Third question, Musselburgh and Leith, why one and not the other? Okay, so yes, indeed, there were 2 boroughs in the amalgamation proposal at the start in 1920, and at the start Musselburgh was in favour, or at least its provost and treasurer and borough officials were, and whereas Leith was throughout the entire time period against the proposal. So it does seem odd that Musselburgh, where it started out as in favour, ended up not being included into the proposal. So there are a number of factors that sort of kind of make a distinction here. So number one, and perhaps the most important, there were no joint trusts, statutory trusts between Musselburgh and Edinburgh. There were no joint services between gas and water lighting, electricity, etc. Musselburgh had its own gas works and had its own sewerage. So there was no crossover in terms of services in relation to that. In fact, it was one of the things that the city officials pointed out was that there would be, comparatively to Musselburgh and Leith, it would be more expensive to amalgamate with Musselburgh to bring the services into harmony. So that was one key point. I think also it's important to say that there was no residential overlap between Musselburgh and Edinburgh, or Musselburgh, the Portobello part of Edinburgh. There was a gap there still at that point in time, though now there's less of one. And so, again, the arguments around the boundary, where Edinburgh was showing pictures of split tenements and roads, with one side being in Leith and one side being in Edinburgh, was not the same for Musselburgh as well. I suppose the third and final reason was that with Musselburgh came the parish of Inveresk, and between the parish of Inveresk and Edinburgh was also the parish of Newton, which was quite a small parish. And so if you took Musselburgh, the argument was that you would need to take those two as well. It was quite a big ask, and there were quite significant landowners in the area, the Earl of Moulton and the Earl of Weymouth in particular, which had significant rights in those areas. And in the House of Lords, it looks like that they certainly pushed for Musselburgh to be taken out of the bill so that their own rights within those parishes were retained. So you've got those 3 points: joint statutory trusts, were services with Leith. That wasn't the same model in Musselburgh, that they were more independent in the service provision that they have. Residential overlap was not an issue in relation to Musselburgh and Edinburgh the same way that Leith was. And thirdly, that to amalgamate with Musselburgh was more than simply just the borough boundaries. It required the absorption of 2 additional parishes, whereas with Leith, it was simply the borough at that point in time. Well, this marks the end of the pre-recorded segment of this talk. And so hopefully now you've been posting questions in the chat channel, and we'll take some time to answer those where we can straight away, or we'll take them away and try and provide more fulsome responses later on during the year.